Now we enter part 2 on this showing of Demuzid, Tammuz, and Adonis, leading on to modern biblical people that we all well know, but this we're not well known of. Again, I have to reiterate that I did a video on this 3.5 years ago or so, and whenever I did so using wiki, I also had to jump around through hoops 4 or 5 different places looking at Bible passages and all kinds of things to derive the video. Now I can almost do it all off of just wiki itself, where it's been changed just recently in December here of 2021. What we're looking at here is what we ended with last time, and this is one of those seals that you see over on the left that is a cylinder. It's got a hole cut through the center of it, and basically what has been done here is whenever they drill the holes that everybody's freaked out about in Egypt and everywhere else, and they pop the little chunk out of there, you'd think that chunk, well, that just gets thrown away. Well, it's real valuable too, because certain people, i.e. the Sumerians, utilize this to make their seals. It's a remarkable thing here for what they've done, because they use clay for a tablature. You know, they have skins and vellum and stuff like that also, but they use this because they figured out using clay and then firing it, you can turn it to stone like magic. But the cylinder seal is carved in reverse relief, basically into the stone, and whenever you roll it along the clay that's here, it shows an embossed representation, which looks like what they did on their walls, where they literally would take everything but the people or depictions that they have there down another 6-8 inches a foot and made it look perfectly flat, almost in a way that these creatures were just bulging out of the rock in a way. People quite often overlook this concept with their art, that it wasn't just the startings of things, because that would be chipped into it like hieroglyphics, but those were done deep so people couldn't change them, because in the earlier times that's what was going on. In fact, all the way through the dynasties, there were people that were coming and renaming place for themselves, like well-known Ramses did, and so on. But we're in Sumeria here, and what we're looking at is a master of beasts type symbology here, and dancing with animals which appear to be a lion and other antelope type quadrupeds, if you will. He's holding on to here, and this is Ama Ushumgal. That's the namesake of the mythical king or shepherd Demuzi that we've been talking about, and his connection with Inanna. So let's get back to where we were in the story here. We had just read the intense poem that has been written of Inanna towards Demuzi, and you can see their love that's there. A lot of people have made connections with other poems of that like, and that the dreaming woo that's in poetry derives from this directly somehow over time. Now that we've had a cigarette, let's talk about death. It's the main narrative here. Towards the end of the epic poem of Inanna's descent in the underworld, Demuzid's wife, Inanna, escapes from the underworld, but is pursued by a horde of Gala demons who insist that someone else must take her place in the underworld. You see, there's this thing there where you can't get by with it, or, well, this also signifies for your sins there can be a sacrifice done, things along that nature. But at this point, they're using it in the mythology, and they're showing you that someone has to take your place in death if she's going to be in life. Of course, in the zodiac, once one rises, another would be falling. They first come upon Inanna's Sukal, Ninshabur, and attempt to take her, but Inanna stops them, insisting that Ninshabur is her royal loyal servant, and that she had rightfully mourned for her whenever she was dead while she was in the underworld. Next they come upon Shara, Inanna's beautician, who is still in mourning at that time, and the demons attempt to take them, but Inanna insists that they may not, because he had also mourned for her and is still doing so. The third person they come upon is Lulal, who is also still in mourning, but the demons try to take him, and Inanna stops them once again. Finally, they come upon Demuzid, who is lavishly clothed and resting under a tree, or in another tale, sitting on Inanna's throne, entertained by slave girls. Inanna, very displeased, decrees that demons can take him, using language which echoes the speech which Ereshkigal gave while condemning her when she herself was going into the underworld, like repeating it. The demons then drag Demuzi down into the underworld. Sounds like something we heard of where a girl gets taken down by a chariot once. And that also comes from this idea too, in the Greek form of it. The Sumerian poem, The Dream of Demuzid, begins with Demuzid telling Gish-Inanna about a frightening dream he has just experienced. Then the Galan demons arrive to drag Demuzid down into the underworld as Inanna's replacement. Demuzid flees and hides, and the Gala demons brutally torture Gish-Inanna in an attempt to force her to tell where Demuzid is hiding. Gish-Inanna, however, refuses to tell him where her brother is gone. The Gala go to Demuzid's unnamed friend, who betrays Demuzid, telling the Gala directly where Demuzid is hiding. In a few tales, it was a fly that whispered in their ear, but the Gala captured Demuzid, but Utu, the sun god, who is also Inanna's brother, rescues Demuzid by transforming him into a gazelle, like we saw before with him standing with the beast, but in another tale his leg shackles were released because his legs became two snakes and slithered right out of it. This is what we showed in Abraxas in a few videos, connecting a lot of things. Eventually, the Gala recapture Demuzid and drag him down into the underworld. In the Sumerian poem, The Return of Demuzid, which begins where the dream Demuzid ends, Gish-Inanna laments continually for days and nights over Demuzid's death, joined by Inanna, who has apparently experienced a change of heart, and Surtur, Demuzid's mother. The three goddesses mourn continually until a fly reveals to Inanna the location of her husband. Together, Inanna and Gish-Inanna go to a place where the fly has told them that they will find Demuzid. They find him there, and Inanna decrees that from that point onwards, Demuzid will spend half the year with her sister Ereshkigal in the underworld, and the other half of the year in heaven with her, while Gish-Inanna takes his place in the underworld. So they ended up giving her sister away to take his place, and that flips back and forth. This is the seasonal change that's described by the Greeks later and by the Sumerians themselves here when everything comes to life. It's very much the Osiris tale too. Even the part about getting cut apart to pieces and in the underworld, and the whole concept is just a variation on a theme. There are other versions though. Other texts describe different and contradictory accounts of Demuzid's death. The text of the poem Inanna in Bilulu, discovered at Nippur, is badly mutilated, and scholars have interpreted it in a number of different ways. The beginning of the poem is mostly destroyed, but seems to be a lament. The intelligible part of the poem describes Inanna pining after her husband, Demuzi, who is in the steppe watching his flocks. Inanna sets out to find him. After this, a large portion of the text is missing. Some portions they believe they have found said that he was gored by a boar. This is also the tale of Mars. And Mars and Jupiter are Mars, and Inanna would be Venus, the queen of heaven. Inanna sets out to find him. After this, a large portion of the text is missing, but when the story resumes, Inanna is being told that Demuzi has been murdered. There's a few different accounts, but Inanna discovers that the old bandit woman Belulu and her son Girgir are responsible. She travels along the road to Eden Lila, notice the word Eden, and stops at an inn where she finds the two murderers. Inanna stands on top of a stool and transforms Belulu into the water skin that men carry into the desert. So an old wineskin or water skin, forcing her to pour the funerary libations for Demuzid. This is Aquarius. Demuzid and Geshtanana begins with demons encouraging Nana to conquer the underworld, but instead she hands Demuzid over to them, where she could have taken on the underworld and freed everyone. She decides to give them Demuzid instead. They put Demuzid's feet and hands and neck into stocks and torture him using hot pokers. They strip him naked and do evil to him and cover his face with his own garment. This is echoed in the Jesus tale of what happened to him. Finally, Demuzid prays for Utu to help, and Utu transforms Demuzid into a creature that is part eagle and part snake, as I said before, allowing him to escape back to Geshtanana. Although it would be part rooster and part snake in the idea of Abraxas. In the text known as Most Bitter Cry, Demuzid is chased by the 7 evil despots of the netherworld. And as he's running, he falls into a river near an apple tree. That sounds familiar. On the other bank, he is dragged into the underworld where everything simultaneously exists and does not exist, perhaps indicating that they exist in a substantial or in immaterial forms, giving rise to the idea of ghosts and spirits, a veil that somehow is there, that these people are right there still. A collection of lamentations for Demuzid entitled In the Desert by the Early Grass describes Damu, the dead anointed one, being dragged down to the underworld by demons who blindfolded him, tie him up, and forbid him from sleeping. Damu's mother tries to follow him into the underworld, but Damu is now a disembodied spirit, lying in the winds and in the lightnings and in tornadoes. They had a lot of belief in the lightning and its power and light and how it comes from and is being used by gods, and of course the winds, the power of the 4 winds. Damu's mother is also unable to eat the food or drink the water in the underworld because it is bad. There's also a tale that if you eat food in the underworld, then you're stuck there forever. Anybody who goes into the underworld and tries to get somebody out and bring them back is told never to eat anything that's from there. This is echoed in the Greeks with persimmon seeds, which let her end up, Persephone end up staying there. But then every spring she's released, and her release is what causes the flowers to grow. Just the fact that she comes up out of the underworld, which we're in the overworld in the northern hemisphere, and the sun goes to the southern hemisphere and then back up. And so, like a bird, she migrates back and forth with it, and in her return, springtime comes. This is also echoed in Jesus and a lot of other gods of the time. But Damu travels along the road of the underworld and encounters various spirits. He meets the ghost of a small child who tells him that he's lost. The ghost of a singer agrees to accompany the child, and Damu asks the spirits to send a message to his mother, but they cannot because they are dead, and the living cannot hear the dead's voices. Damu, however, manages to tell his mother to dig up his blood and chop it into pieces. Damu's mother gives the congealed blood to Damu's sister Ashmalima, who is a leech. Ashmalima mixeth congealed blood into a brew of beer, which Damu must drink in order to be restored to life. Damu, however, realizes that he is dead and declares that he is not in the grass which shall grow for his mother again, nor in the waters which will rise. Damu's mother blesses him, and Ashmalima dies to join him in the underworld. She tells him that the day that dawns for you will also dawn for me. The day you see, I will also see, referring to the fact that day in the world above is night in the underworld, in reverse. So you see, they just thought they were like on the dark side of the moon, or they would be in the underworld, where everything flipped to during the night and then come back around during the day, having to do with the zodiac that's unseen at that time also. Later we have Akkadian tales. In the myth of Adapa, or as we know of him, Adama or Adam, Demuzid and Ningishita are the two doorkeepers of Anu, the gods of heaven, the god of the heavens, who speak out in favor of Adapa, the priest of Ea, as he stands trial before Anu. You see, what he did was he got his boat turned over, and then he cursed the south wind, and it broke his wing, effectively, or its wind-making device, and there was no south wind for a long period of time for that. People have said this is also something to do with weather and showing a large weather pattern that went on for a period of time, or perhaps some type of destruction that went on because of weather like that. Like if there was to be a hurricane or typhoon come right up the Tigris and Euphrates in a way. So, in the tablet 6 of the standard Akkadian epic of Gilgamesh, Ishtar, which is Inanna, attempts to seduce the hero Gilgamesh, but he rebuffs her, reminding her that she had struck Tammuz, Demuzid, the lover of her youth, decreeing that he should keep weeping year after year and go through this problem, and that he only would be able to be alive half the year and everything if he was to become her counterpart. Gilgamesh describes Tammuz as a colorful alalu bird, possibly a European or Indian roller, whose wing has been broken and now spends all of his time in the woods crying, "My wing, my wing." This reminds me of when I was a kid watching Kildees, and how if they had a nest near, they would come up and start saying something that sounded almost like that, with one wing stuck out like it's broken, trying to draw you off, like if you were a dog trying to attack, and they would try to lead you on, and if you ran after them, they'd fly off, but then they'd land real quick and act like, "Oh, my wing, come get me," and all the time they're trying to take you away from their hidden nest. Here's a depiction of possibly a European roller. They're known as this because they have a strange flight pattern, like swallowtail birds do sometimes. Other people have said that this connection is actually the white dove of Inanna, and that there are doves and pigeons that are known as rollers that'll go up, and then they start, through a semi-epileptic fit almost, they go up and they start doing flips. And then they straighten out, and then they'll start doing flips like it's a big show. They thought that might actually be something that's a little more akin to what we're talking about. But this bird, whose wing has been broken, now spends all of its time in the woods crying, "My wing, my wing," and Gilgamesh may be referring to an alternative account of Demuzid's death, different from the ones recorded in an extant text. See, so there's people taking some of theirs and mushing it into the story there and changing the soup a little bit sometimes. And then it makes you wonder which one was the earlier telling and why was it changed, even by the Sumerians, or given a different outlook. If you look at the two different forms, it's two different forms of trying to tell you the same thing, just in a different way. In extreme allegory, which is quite unique from what we thought people just before this were able to do. This weird prose, like what we find in the Bible too later. So Anton Mordecai has interpreted Demuzi as the antithesis of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh refuses Ishtar's demand for him to become her lover, seeks immortality himself, and fails to find it. Well, actually, he does find it. He's not given immortality, but a fountain of youth, if you will, and a sacred plant that's under a certain place at the edge of the world. And he goes down and gets it, and then instead of consuming it or do what he needed to do, he comes back, and while resting by a pond, a snake comes up and steals it. He wakes up and realizes that and looks just to see the snake slithering off into the distance, but he's also just freshly shed. This is supposed to give you the idea of a snake rebirth every time he sheds his skin, like a person could shed their skin and become anew. Not a fountain of youth idea. Demuzid, by contrast, accepts Ishtar's offer, and as a result of her love and hatred whenever something goes wrong or that he didn't mourn enough for her, is able to spend half the year in heaven, even though he's condemned to the underworld for the other half. This is a zodiacal representation where you could see the zodiac for half the year, and the other half, it would be on its head in the other world. Mehmet Ali Atak further argues that Tammuz model of immortality was far more prevalent in the ancient Near East than the Gilgamesh model. It was much more encompassing, even after the point, and Marduk too, which did try to consume. In a chart of antediluvian generators in Babylonian and biblical traditions, William Wolfgang Hallow associates Demuzid with the composite half-man, half-fish counselor or culture hero Apkallu, or An Enlada, which suggests an equivalence between Demuzid and Enoch in the Sethite genealogy given in Genesis chapter 5, by the way. If you want another connection, if you haven't been getting 15 or 20 already. Later worship, where does it come to? Well, the later worship for this person is described in the Bible. The cult of Ishtar and Tammuz may have been introduced to the kingdom of Judah during the reign of King Manasseh, and the Old Testament contains numerous allusions to them. Ezekiel 8:14 mentions that Tammuz, actually by name, which is Demuzi, then he brought me to the door of the gate of the Lord's house. Where? The Lord's house, which was towards the north. And behold, there sat women weeping for Tammuz. Then he said unto me, Hast thou seen this, O son of man? Turn thee yet again, and thou shalt see greater abominations than these. See, he called someone their son of man, and Ezekiel wasn't talking to Jesus at all. That's why some of the things and expressions that were taken out of the Old Testament was putting everything all together for people again, bringing it back to the original Alpha and Omega, which I recently did a video about. Ezekiel's testimony is the only direct mention of Tammuz in the Hebrew Bible directly, but there are other mentions. The cult of Tammuz may also be alluded to in Isaiah 17:10 through 11, because thou hast forgotten the God of thy salvation, and hast been mindful of the rock of thy strength. Therefore thou shalt plant pleasant plants, and shall set it with strange slips, like words or writings or wishes. And in that day thou shalt make thy plant to grow, and in the morning thou shalt make thy seed to flourish, but in the harvest shall be a heap in the day of grief and of desperate sorrow. This is also alluding to times of drought, things like that, and that they were trying to connect it to, that you know, if you could just worship more, the rain would come, things like that. Of course, at this time, we probably have a better realization of how things are all working, whether you want to say God's a mechanism behind that or not. Kind of a God of the gaps, but that's for another video. But they talk about making these plants and then they don't come to fruition. Well, this passage may be describing the miniature gardens, like the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, that women would plant in honor of Tammuz. During his festival, Isaiah 1:29 and 30, and Isaiah 65:3, and Isaiah 66:17 all denounce sacrifices made in the gardens, which that's where everything all started at, wasn't it? Which may also be connected to the cult of Tammuz. Another possible allusion of Tammuz occurs in Daniel, passage 11:37. Neither shall he regard the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any God, for he shall magnify himself above all. The subject of this passage is Antiochus 4 Ephanes, and some scholars have interpreted the reference to the one desired by women in this passage as an indicating that Antiochus may have persecuted the cult of Tammuz. There's no external evidence to support this reading, however, and it's much more probable that in this epithet it's merely a jibe at Antiochus's notorious cruelty towards all the women who fell in love with him. The Hebrew Bible also contains references to Tammuz's consort Inanna Ishtar. In Jeremiah 7:18 and Jeremiah 44:15 through 19 mention the Queen of Heaven, which is Ishtar, Inanna, Venus, who is probably a synchronism of Inanna Ishtar and West Semitic goddess Ashtarte. The Song of Songs in the Bible bears strong similarities to the Sumerian love poems involving Inanna and Demuzi, which I read you a portion of one before, particularly in its usage of natural symbolism to represent the lover's physicality. Like your eyes are like limpid pools in Lesbon and things like that. What are you describing to her, And, I see the sky in your eyes. Does she have blue eyes? It looks like the sky, and he's just swooning after her. A limpid pool is a snail pool. It was supposed to have blue water in it. So the Song of Songs bears similarities to the Sumerian love poems, as we talked about, particularly in its usage of natural symbolism to represent the lover's physicality. Song of Songs 6:10, who is she that looketh forth as the morning, fair as the moon, clear as the sun, and terrible as an army with banners, is almost certainly a reference to Inanna Ishtar, the goddess of love who became the goddess of war. Diana, well, that's D-O, Anna, like Inanna. In was Lord in the ancient Sumerians script, like Enki. Kia is the earth, the world, just like Gaia, which is extremely similar in the Greeks. So we have a huge connection here, and the Greeks actually took this into the idea of Adonis, but we'll get there in just a minute. The myth of Inanna and Demuzid later became the basis of the Greek myth of Aphrodite and Adonis. The Greek name Adonis pronunciation is derived from the Canaanite word Adon, meaning Lord. But there was someone who represented that before it was just a common vowel or a common name, right? The earliest known Greek reference to Adonis comes from a fragment of poem by the lesbian poetess Sappho, the island of Lesbos, dating to the 7th century BC, in which a chorus of young girls ask Aphrodite what they can do to mourn Adonis's death. Aphrodite replies that they must beat their breasts and tear their tunics and clothing. Later recensions of the Adonis legend reveal that he was believed to have been slain by a wild boar during a hunting trip, i.e. that one Sumerian tablet. According to Lucian's Dia de Syria, or Gods of Syria, each year during the festival of Adonis, the Adonis River in Lebanon, now known as the Abraham River, ran red with blood. Well, it ran red with red ochre dye from women dyeing a bunch of things and then pouring off the rest of it into the river, the same way that the idea that you hear later of this concept of being able to turn the Nile to blood or to red and things in the Bible. It's probably taken directly from that. In Greece, the myth of Adonis was associated with the festival of Adonia, which was celebrated by Greek women every year in midsummer. The festival, which was evidently already celebrated by Lesbos in Sappho's time and well before, I'm telling you that it goes back to the ancient Sumerians, seems to have first become popular in Athens in the mid-5th century BC. At the start of the festival, the women would plant a garden of Adonis, a small garden planted inside of a small basket or a shallow piece of even broken pottery containing a variety of quick-growing plants, such as lettuce or fennel, or even quick-sprouting plants such as wheat and barley. The women would then climb ladders to the roofs of their houses, where they would place the gardens out under the heat of the summer sun. The plants would sprout in the sunlight and grow quickly, like you did whenever you were a kid with a bean, but also wither quickly in the heat. Then the women would start mourning and lamenting loudly over the death of Adonis, tearing their clothes and beating their breasts in a public display of grief. They would throw dirt over their heads and just scream and cry, and you could not get them to quit. One of the reasons, women are very emotional and stuff, people have made the comment, well, they used to have women professionally do this. It was something that they wanted, to have mourners for people and stuff, and they would hire a group of mourners. You can see a group of mourners in different Egyptian depictions too. If you ever seen a large funeral procession, you'll see a group of mourners, but they usually aren't wailing, slapping their breasts around and tearing their clothes and throwing dirt over their head anymore. But one might understand it if they did. So, the 3rd century BC poet Euphorion of Chalcis, remarked by his Hyacinth that only Cocytus watched the wounds of Adonis. Well, what's Cocytus? Well, Cocytus, or Koikitos, is the river wailing in the underworld in the Greek mythology. Cocytus flows into the river Archetypes, on the other side of which lies Hades, the underworld, the mythical abode of the dead. There are 5 rivers encircling Hades, which we all know about the Styx, but there are Letharon, Lethe, Archeron, and Cocytus. And they said that this was the one that washed him. But of course, these rivers are cognate to other rivers of their origins, actually. And this would have been Tigris and Euphrates. Survival in the Christian era? Well, traditional Mesopotamian religion began to gradually decline between the 3rd and 5th centuries AD. About the same time you really saw the rise of Christianity. If you look into it, it really didn't happen right off the bat. Something much later. So, this did so as ethnic Assyrians converted to Christianity. Nonetheless, the cult of Ishtar and Tammuz managed to survive in parts of Upper Mesopotamia, some say until the 18th century. The church father Jerome records in a letter dated to the year 395 AD that Bethlehem, belonged to us now, was overshadowed by a grove of Tammuz, that is to say, Adonis, and in the cave where once the infant Christ cried, the lover of Venus was lamented. I had to use this in that other video because it wasn't in here at the time, to show you the connections that even these people are putting together. You can see it sometimes when they say, well, this is that and everything, and it shows you storm god, so he's Zeus, so he's this. The Sky Father, well, everybody had that was under Proto-European, or what we no longer call Aryan type of worship and belief. So it was overshadowed by that grove of Tammuz, and that's Adonis. And in the cave where once the infant Christ cried, the lover Venus was lamented. Now, this same cave later became the site of the Church of the Nativity. The church historian Eusebius, however, does not mention pagans ever worshiping in the cave. Of course not. Nor do any other Christian writers. Of course not. Peter Welton has argued that the cave was never dedicated to Tammuz, although it seems to have been, and the people well knew it, and that Jerome misinterpreted Christian mourning over the massacre of the innocents as pagan ritual over Tammuz's death. Joni Taylor has countered this contention by arguing that Jerome, as an educated man, could not have been so naive as to mistake Christian mourning over the massacre of the innocents as a pagan ritual for Tammuz, and therefore it was going on. Tammuz is the month of July in Iraqi Arabic and Levantine Arabic, and in the Hebrew calendars, as well as the Assyrian calendar and, well, I just said, the Jewish calendar, and references to Tammuz appear in Arabic literature from the 9th to 11th century AD. So it just rolled on through. In what purports to be a translation of an ancient Nabatean, here meaning Aramaean, text by Quathma the Babylonian, Ibn Washia, the 9th and 10th century AD, adds information on his own efforts to ascertain the identity of Tammuz and his discovery of the full details of the legend of Tammuz in another Nabatean book. How is he summoned, the king to worship the 7 planets and the 12 signs of the zodiac, and how the king put him to death several times in cruel manner, Tammuz coming to life again after each time, until at last he died, and behold, it was identical to the legend of St. George. Yeah, that's carried all the way through that time. Of course, St. George killed a dragon, didn't he? Ibn Washir also adds that Tammuz lived in Babylonia before the coming of the Chaldeans and belonged to an ancient Mesopotamian tribe called Ganban. On rituals related to Tammuz in this time, he adds that the Sabaeans in Haran and Babylonia still lamented the loss of Tammuz every July, but that the origin of the worship had been lost. In the 10th century AD, the Arab traveler Al-Nadim wrote that his Kitab al-Farist that all the Sabaeans of our time, those of Babylonia as well as those of Haran, lament and weep to this day over Tammuz at the festival which they, more particularly the women, hold in the month of the same name. Drawing from a work on Syriac calendar feast days, Al-Nadim describes a Tammuz festival that took place in the middle of the month of Tammuz. Women bewailed the death of Tammuz at the hands of his master, who was said to have ground his bones in a mill and scattered them to the wind. Consequently, women would forego eating of the ground foods during the festival time. The same festival is mentioned in the 11th century by Ibn Athir, who recounts that it still took place every year at the appointed time along the banks of the Tigris River. The cult of Ishtar and Tammuz still existed in Mardin as late as the 18th century. Tammuz is still the name for the month of July in Iraqi Arabic and Hebrew calendars. We may end up going to a part 3 in this. If we do, it's going to be a very short one. This is going to kick at 45 minutes. As a dying and rising god. The late 19th century Scottish anthropologist Sir James George Fraser wrote extensively about Tammuz in his monumental study of comparative religion, The Golden Bough, first edition of which was published back in 1890. As well as in later works, Fraser claimed that Tammuz was just one example of the archetype of a dying and rising god found throughout all the cultures. Yeah, all that pagan people already had all that things going on. I don't know what you make you think. Oh, this is special, though. Fraser and others also saw Tammuz's Greek equivalent, Adonis, as a dying and rising god. Origen discusses Adonis, whom he associates with Tammuz, in his Selecta the Eishheim, which is comments on Ezekiel, noting that they say that for a long time certain rites of initiation are conducted. First, that they weep for him since he has died. Second, that they rejoice for him because he has risen from the dead. Tammuz's categorization as a dying and rising sun god was based on the abbreviated Akkadian redaction of Inanna's descent into the underworld, where they changed it, which was missing the ending. Since numerous lamentations over the death of Demuzid had already been translated, Scholars filled in the missing ending by assuming that the reason for Ishtar's descent was because she was going to resurrect Demuzid, and that the next text could therefore be assumed to end with Demuzid's resurrection. Then in the middle of the 12th century, the complete, unabridged original Sumerian text of Inanna's descent was finally translated, revealing that instead of ending with Demuzid's resurrection, as long been assumed, the text actually ended with Demuzid's death, which was a real flip-flop for a minute, but hold on a second. The rescue of Demuzid from the underworld was later found in the text Return of Demuzid, translated in 1963. Biblical scholars Paul Eddy and Greg Boyd argued in 2007 that this text does not describe a triumph over death because Demuzid must be replaced in the underworld by his sister, thus reinforcing the unalterable power of the realm of the dead. However, other scholars have cited this as an example of a god who was previously dead and risen again. You can put down in the comments what you think. I'll tell you right now, yeah, if you come back from the dead, even if it's back and forth, or whatever the story is that recreates the seasons, just like it does in Egypt and so many other places, especially we're relying on river systems here, that it would be a re-rising of him, and he would be back alive. Is he alive? He's in the land of the living. It's the land of the dead, land of the living, land of the dead, as the zodiac spins round and round. Sun come up, moon go down, world spin round and round. Time for another lesson, grasshopper. We have a few examples here of Oscar Wilde and other people giving mention to their idea of Tammuz, and that it still mentions at it in the calls for Tammuz, damsels lamenting and so on. Here, if we look at the Sumerian pantheon, if you will, in a major part of the version, here we have On at the very start. On has had different children in Saba, which goes back through and leading to Haya, and Ninlil, which is the wife of Enlil, leading down to Nergal, which some say may be the son of Ninurta or Enki, and Ninurta may be born by Ninharsag. So we can see how when Enlil took over, they took some of this from over here and put it over here. This looks a little thicker, and this looks a little thin, doesn't it? Right. Well, Inanna comes out for the middle of this, and Inanna and Demuzid get together from this situation here. Demuzid is supposed to, in many cases, supposed to be the son of Enki. So we can see how that leads down, and here we see through Utu and the sun god. See, sun god and sprouting what has happened before that is Lugalbanda, which many of you might have heard, the Lord of Enmerkar, you may have heard about, but also Gilgamesh himself right here.